I'm Francis Levy, co-director of the Philoctetes Center. The Philoctetes Center began as a discussion about imagination. Imagination being the palette of psychoanalysis, we are interested in what creative people who had particular access to the imaginative life could tell us about analysis, and conversely, what analysis could tell us about the process of creativity. Welcome to the psychology of the modern nation state. I am now pleased to introduce Peter Loewenberg. Peter Loewenberg is Dean Emeritus of the New Center for Psychoanalysis in Los Angeles and Professor of History at UCLA. He's the author of Decoding the Past, The Psychohistorical Approach, and Fantasy and Reality in History, and numerous articles. Professor Loewenberg will moderate this afternoon's panel and introduce the other panelists. I give you Professor Loewenberg.
Thank you, Ed. We'd like to acknowledge the good offices who made this possible, this roundtable, and Ellen Fertig, who did a lot of the work, the fundament of which you see the product. And I think it'd be nice today to remember Bill Grossman. His picture was in Philoctetes #1, Volume 1, together with Francis. And the last time I was a participant here, he was on the panel. Just a lovely man, a wonderful analyst, member of this institute, generous, broad, and I remember many wonderful conversations with him. The last contact I had with Bill Grossman, I needed a referral in London, and he sent me 3 names, and I wrote him back. I said, I didn't know you were referring to Kleinians in London. And he said, I like their work. I like the kind of work they do. So we miss him today. Today we have a wonderful constellation of international experts on the nation state, and I'm going to go around the round table and introduce them to you. To my right here is Professor Shukri Abed, who is chair of the Department of Middle East, of the Regional Studies Department of the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. Shukri is a specialist in medieval Islam and has just published a book out of Yale University Press this week. Congratulations on medieval Arabic. He is a Palestinian Israeli, and we all know that this issue that we're taking up today is the central issue of the modern world. We are at war today. We're at war in the Middle East. We have the issues of what is the nation state and who can belong in Lebanon, in Palestine, Israel, in Cyprus, which we'll get to, and elsewhere. The issue is so important that your very existence depends on what kind of piece of paper you have in your pocket. I experienced this when I was a student in Berlin in 1961. People who had the right piece of paper could cross the Berlin Wall, and others couldn't. In fact, others were shot. And the experience of the world in the 1930s and 40s was if you didn't have the right piece of paper, you died. So very happy to have Shukri with us. Next, there's Professor Giorgio Freddi of the University of Bologna and affiliated with the University of California, Berkeley, Irvine, and Los Angeles. Giorgio is the leading political scientist of Europe today. He was chair of the European Political Consortium, and he is a Weberian in his approach to institutions. He studies bureaucracies of the nation state and has written about the delivery of healthcare systems, the comparative delivery of healthcare systems in Europe, politics of health governance. Professor Isser Woloch, next to him, is a specialist in the French Revolution and the Napoleonic era. He doesn't just do the French Revolution, he does after the Revolution and into the Restoration. He's a professor of history at Columbia and has written widely on that era, and that's the era when the modern nation-state was born. And he will enrich our discussion in that direction today. And to my left is Professor Vamik Volkan, who is a psychoanalyst and for a long time headed the Center for Mind and Human Action in Charlottesville, Virginia, UVA. I had the pleasure of encountering him this summer when he was Sigmund Freud professor in Vienna. He's now Erickson Scholar at the Austin Riggs and has written widely and preeminently on the problems of nationalism. And next week he will be in South Africa and paying a laudation to Bishop Tutu. So let's begin our discourse and go around. Since I started the introductions this way, Vamik, why don't you open with your ideas on the nation state?
That was sneaky. That's called the hot seat. I think what I like to say, because it is the psychology of modern nation state. And since I'm a psychoanalyst and I'm supposed to know about individual psychology, I think we should say something about the relationship between individual psychology and psychology of large groups, just for an opening. And since large groups, I'm talking about nation groups or ethnic groups or religious groups, there are hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people. They're made of people, so people psychology is going to be reflected in large group psychology. But no large group has one brain, no large group has two eyes. Therefore, when the individual psychology gets reflected in large group psychology, you're not going to see people crying or whatever. Those things are going to be appearing in societal and political processes. And now something about new nation states. You refer to what's going on in the world right now, which is the whole world is in regression. Thank God, maybe we may go up now. In the regress state, you will see that there will be new nation state. Middle East, I have no idea how it's going to settle. But I want to make one point, because among many points, that is when people lose people, prestige, land, dignity, they have to mourn. So the psychology of mourning is extremely important, not only in individual people, but also in the evolution of nation states or new nation states. When people cannot mourn, due to many reasons, I can come to that later on, then they have to develop many, many things. One of the things, is in the paper, is that they may develop ideology of irredentism to recover their losses. So you are going to have many, many nation states who are going to be dealing with mourning process, one. Number two, irredentist ideas. Number three, if they're still helpless, idealization of victimization, which has its own consequences, and issues of borders that is referred in this paper. So this is just, I can talk more, but you don't want me to talk more. When we are discussing this thing, we have to compare individual psychology with large group psychology constantly, because if you just stay with individual psychology, then you don't understand political, societal processes which reflect the large groups of psychology. However, you have to deal with individual psychology, because when societies are regressed, the personality of the leader assumes a great deal of importance. And there, of course, you have to look at the individual psychology. Justin Frank is there, in order to understand some of the societal processes.
Thank you. That's a great starter. Yes,
Well,
sir.
if you will promise to give me another pass at the French Revolution specifically, I'd rather say something to sort of take up this line of thinking. Not that I can speak to the psychology of either the mass or the individual, but a more general point about the nation, which is to cite a very famous essay by Ernst Renan called What is the Nation? It was a lecture that he gave in 1882, not immediately after, but still in the wake of the Franco-Prussian War, when the French had lost Alsace-Lorraine, which was about as contentious an issue today, I suppose, as the Israeli-Palestinian issue might be. I mean, as contentious in that day, at least between France and Germany, as such issues as the Israeli-Palestinian issue would be today. In any case, Renan took a very novel approach. His essay actually is mistitled. It should have been called "What Should the Nation Be?" I'm not sure it passes as an actual description of what a nation is, but it's sort of a template for an ideal notion of a nation. And he begins by rejecting a number of very familiar categories and concepts as to what would constitute a nation. He rejects race as the basis of a nation, saying race is much too insubstantial and motile a concept. Races fade, they redevelop, they mutate. Race did not seem to be the basis. Language is not the basis of a nation. He points to Switzerland, which is in a sense a nation that has three different languages. He mentions the United States and Britain, which have the same language but nonetheless do not constitute one nation. He says religion obviously is not the foundation of a nation. He even says that geography is not the foundation of a nation. He has a famous phrase about the rivers expand and mountains hem people in, and he went on to argue that geography per se, soil and boundaries, are not really the essence of a nation. So then what does that leave? What is a nation? Well, he points to two things. A shared common experience, which would normally consist of both glory and grief, as he puts it. So that's what really led me to want to interject this. The ability to mourn, you said, is a crucial element in a healthy development of a national identity and a sense of nation. Well, Renan put it more boldly. He said that there has to be a common heritage to draw on, and it would normally consist of memories of glorious achievements, sacrifice, and grief. So that's the first point. The second point is, though, that a nation really, that man is the essence of a nation, and that the essence of a nation is the will of a particular generation to be part of that nation. In other words, he went so far as to say that it is essentially a nation is an agglomeration of people who choose to be part of a nation. And he even at one point made the extravagant observation that a nation is like a daily plebiscite, which I think is actually quite, well, not absurd, but way over the top. But nonetheless, will is the essence. Will and, in effect, consent. An ongoing kind of consent is what makes for a healthy nation. Then he added one other crucial point, which is that forgetting is part of what constitutes a nation. You have to mourn. You have to take pride in the glorious achievements of the past. You have to pay homage to the sacrifice in the past history of this nation. But you also have to know how to forget. And I think that observation is what particularly, I think, makes Renan always of interest to contemporaries today, to remember this point about forgetting. So I'll pass now with the understanding that I get a chance at some point to talk about the French Revolution.
Absolutely. Giorgio.
No, the leaflet which introduces our debate of today legitimately is centered on examples of the dynamic potentialities of nationhood. And indeed the two examples made there are the Balkanization of the Soviet Empire and the recomposition of German unity. I would like to call your attention to other very important static properties of the nation state. If we pay attention to the continuities observable between the original nation state, born in the 17th century out of the Peace of Westphalia, and the major states of contemporary continental Europe, we will be amazed how important what happened in Westphalia is to understand what goes on in Europe nowadays. Just very quickly, let's go over the original descriptive definition of the nation state, the original nation state born in Westphalia. It's a political community with a centralized source of legislation and taxation, homogeneously applied to a population sharing the same culture, the same language, and the same religion. Cuius regio eius religio, as the Huguenots learned at their expense. You don't practice the religion which is not that of your king. And living on a territory characterized by clear and secure borders. The nation state is also about creating where you put the immigration office of Spain and the immigration office of France. Now, the original nation state, as I've just briefly defined, introduced two radically new instruments of governance, not existing before. I mean, the monarchical absolutism and despotic and enlightened despotism are magnificent periods of history. I mean, it's great. I mean, they have a bad reputation among us, but as a political, social, economic phenomenon, it's staggering. You know, it's really a great step toward modernization. And the two new instruments introduced were, on the ideological gradient, the notion of sovereignty. Less studied, but possibly more important, on the operational gradient of governance, a professional bureaucracy imbued with the values of the bourgeoisie, which was already the actor in producing wealth in those days, even though completely cut off politics. Now, what are the important traits of governance, of monarchic absolutism and enlightened despotism, which are still with us nowadays? A meticulously hierarchic structure, where every stratum and the individual has a pre-assigned role, governed by the equally meticulous network of rules created by the bureaucracy. Despite authoritarianism prevailing in Europe until the French Revolution, the creation of a complex bureaucracy which gave themselves rules created for the first time the probability that government action was predictable and to some extent controllable. There must be judges in Berlin, said the military. Don't you remember that? There must be some judges in Berlin to the king. And there you have also the beginning. This is maybe a surprise to those who are not adept to this kind of literature. You know, that if you go through a boring sounding school of thought, the cameralistic school of Prussia and to some extent of Austria of those days, you run into extraordinary expression. You run frequently into the expression Polizeistaat, which means the state which intervenes, not the police, the state which intervenes in societal and economic affairs. And the expression Wohlfahrtsstaat is there. No, the welfare state is not an invention of the Brits perfected by the Scandinavians. It's an invention of Otto von Bismarck, who introduced social security and health care for the working class in Germany. That's where the welfare state was born. And this is the properties of the nation state as modernized by the constitutional revolution at the beginning of the 19th century, but it's still there. I was talking with the gentleman who's sitting on my right hand today. One of the name escapes me, but a famous French historian of the French Revolution begins with a very elegant sentence. Usually the French are very elegant when they start the book, saying the French Revolution changed everything in France. Economics, society, religion, the way people approach each other, except one, la fonction publique. Central administration is still there as it was under Colbert. Colbertism, mercantilism, and for instance, it is not a coincidence nowadays in Europe when they want to justify the reason why along the Rhine River the most allegedly private corporations are controlled by public authorities, or to explain why the French government always vetoes the taking over of French corporation by corporation not in France. Neo-Colbertism is the word they use now, which is really, I would say, a fig leaf to avoid saying mercantilism, which is, again, one of the legacies of the nation state. Later on, I would like to react to possible questions from the public. I would like to characterize in psychological and anthropological terms the properties of the nation state as operational now in continental Europe.
Great. We'll pick that up. Shukri.
Well, as Peter said, I'm Palestinian, Israeli, and probably my analysis of the situation will focus certainly on the Middle East, and it will be colored by my personal identity, being a Christian minority within a minority in the Jewish state, Christian Palestinian in the Jewish state, and probably that, reading Peter's analysis of psychoanalysis, I understand that means that I always seek compromise, because I want to combine all of my the various components of my identity. That's why I probably associate with people like Peter, who seek to find solutions to our many troubles in the Middle East, because it's solution to my personal identity, probably. And of course, the Middle East is itself is seeking identity. The concept of nation state in the Middle East is a new concept, like democracy, like nationalism, like secularism. All these concepts were brought to Europe after the demise of the Ottoman Empire, or slightly before that, with the invasion of Napoleon to the Middle East. So the Middle East is still going through crisis and seeking an identity, seeking to find identity after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, because for 400 years the Ottomans ruled the entire Arab world, with the exception of parts of Arabia, which were tribes, and but the rest of it was under one unit called the Ottoman Empire, and since then they were orphaned basically, and were thrown into the hands of European, French, and British in particular. And they are really, since then, they are asking themselves, who are we? Are we Muslims? Can we survive in this world where our values are changing constantly? What are we really? Can we maintain ourselves, our identity as Muslims, as Arabs, while everything else is imported from the outside? These are the kind of questions that the Middle East is going through. Terrible crisis, but at the same time, the two processes of that are proposed for discussion, the Balkanization and what do you call it, irredentism, did take place in the Middle East. One in Iraq is currently taking place, the Balkanization. The Sudan is probably for the future, is going to take place. Lebanon, almost. Algeria. If you add to that list, if we expand the scope, the continent of India experienced similar thing when in 1947 Pakistan split from India, and then later on 1973 Bangladesh split from Pakistan. So that's a process of Balkanization, but also the opposite process of happened in the Middle East. Despite all these struggles, despite this fragmentation that we see in the Middle East, there is the two Yemens united in 1994, South and North Yemen. That became one nation based on national common geography, common history, common language, common religion. United Arab Emirates, 7 emirates who were separate, united. Then there was an attempt in 1958 by Nasser, the greatest Arab leader of this century. In many ways, he attempted to, for 3 years, the union with Syria, again based on common history and common language and common religion, to define the nation state. They tried to unite, and then Iraq, of all countries, Iraq tried twice to invade Kuwait, once under Qasim in 1963, but was stopped by Nasser, actually. Nasser stopped him. They said, if you want Arab unity, it should be really done in peaceful means, like we did with Syria. It didn't succeed in Syria, but nevertheless it was done in a democratic way, by peaceful means. But then Saddam Hussein, of course, in 1990 did invade Kuwait on the basis that the Iraqi ideology is based on the fact that, or believes that Kuwait is part of Iraq, and we should redeem that lost part of Iraq. They call it the 17th province of Iraq. Now, going back to some of the remarks that were made here about the nation state, the concept of the nation state, I think some great Arab thinkers have introduced their view of what is a nation. Particularly, I'm referring here to the 14th century historian, sociologist Ibn Khaldun, who was born in Tunis and then died in Cairo. He visited Cairo, but he loved the city so much that he decided to stay there and not to return to his country. And he wrote this fantastic book, which I think is one of the best books ever written in history, called the Muqaddimah, the Introduction to the Science of History, and in which he displayed his views of the nation, the formation of nation, the forming of a nation. Of course, he was examining the historical, what he saw, what he experienced, the Islamic history. And he was talking about tribes and how they formed a nation and what is required to really to form a nation. He uses a specific term called asabiyya, which is blood link, or and asabiyya, in which he says that this is the major characteristic of linking people together. And then later on, there are other factors that I will be happy to elaborate on. Thank you.
Thank you, Shukri. I'd like my contribution to the dialogue to pick up where we have a foundation here. And it is the experience of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which all of you know. You have in your mind's eye the map of Europe before 1918. It was a multinational empire with Slovenes, Slovaks, Czechs, Poles, Italians. In this house, you will remember that.
Hungarians.
Yeah, but I just want to remind this house that Sigmund Freud holidayed in Milan and in the Grodental of northern Italy, and it was Austrian at that time. So I'm going to get back there. But yeah, there were Ruthenians, Romanians, and a multinational empire on the same territory in this large Austro-Hungarian empire. And people felt the tensions. They said it's going to blow apart, and in fact it did blow apart in 1914 and caused World War I, which I think as a historian was the greatest tragedy of 20th century history. There may be others, but it caused so much misery. The World War I really ended 100 years of peace in Europe. And some of the best thinkers of Austria-Hungary, and they are people like Otto Bauer, who was an Austro-Marxist, Karl Renner, who was chancellor in 1918, thought we have to figure out ways to solve these nationality problems. It was the nationality issue. And their solution was the Personalprinzip, that people, and here we become psychoanalytic, people should have an identity, a national identity, and it's based on people they feel good with, feel intimate with. And they should register in Vienna their national group, and a big portion of their taxes should go then to the Czech theater, culture, schools, and public institutions, libraries, and so forth, Czech, Slovene, etc. And they could occupy, they used the metaphor of a city, that everybody shares the public utilities, the water, the electricity, the streets, but we have private homes, and that's where the discourse takes place in your own language of communication. Now, their ideas were not adopted. Austria-Hungary blew apart. However, in 1950, in fact, before 1950, 1945, Karl Renner was the president of the new Austria, post-war Austria, the Second Republic. And Alcide de Gasperi of Italy was premier. And he came from Trento, from this area that had a German-speaking population, but in the peace of 1918, as you will know, Italy got the watershed. They got the Brenner frontier, including a lot of Germans. So it's a problem. There were pylon wars, dynamiting, and so on. They wanted to go back to Austria. Well, in 1946, Helmut Gruber, the Austrian foreign minister under Renner, and the Italian prime minister made an agreement that's called the Gruber-de Gasperi Agreement in Paris. And they said, and this goes to the point that Freddi raised about sovereignty, they said, we recognize Italian sovereignty. And we recognize the border of Italy for these people. However, Austria was acknowledged to have a cultural protective function, kulturelle Schutzfunktion, over the culture of these people, so that everybody in the Alto Adige, the German word for the river is Etsch, in Italian it's the Adige, Südtirol, had a choice. You want to send your children to an Austrian school, you want to send them to an Italian school, or a Ladino one, which was the local language. And very elegant arrangements were worked out that took years. There was 137 paragraphs in this agreement. It's called a paquet, a package. And it wasn't until 1992 that the two legislatures in Vienna and Rome agreed that all the conditions had been fulfilled. But it includes spectacular things. This is a solution I'm putting forward, such as law, that people can testify in court under their own language, that the University of Innsbruck in Austria teaches Italian law, and the professors are from the University of Padua, and with that license you can practice law in Italy. Well, a citizen of New York is in the New York bar, but they can't go down to Virginia and practice law. You know that. School teachers, graduates of the Austrian universities, Graz, Vienna, Linz, can teach in the Alto Adige. And I had the experience of just teaching in Vienna this summer, and many of my students were from Südtirol. They said, I'm a Südtirolese, and so on. And they are admitted under the same conditions and the same low tuition as Austrian citizens. I mean, it's fantastic. School books come out of Austria. And I have visited this area often, and I can tell you, if there were a referendum today, the people love it. They would stick with it because, and this is exceptional for the Italian states, very generous, 90% of the taxes stay there. It does not get down to Sicily and so on. It stays there. It's very content. So here is a solution that incorporates sovereignty, but that's not the main issue. Borders aren't the main issue. The main issue is how people feel in their culture. Now, it's no coincidence that all the leading scholars of nationalism came out of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, usually from the German-speaking community of Prague. I'm referring to Erich Gellner, Hans Kohn, Karl Deutsch, Erich Hobsbawm. They're all Austrians from that generation. And I want to read you just one brief sentence from Karl Deutsch's book, Nationalism and Social Communication, and you will recognize how analytic it sounds. He says, at every step we find social communication bound up indissolubly with the ends and means of life, with men's values and the patterns of their teamwork, with employment and promotion, with marriage and inheritance. I mean, these are the things we talk about in analysis. With the preferences of buyers and sellers, and with economic security or distress, with all the psychological, political, social, economic relationships that influence the security and happiness of individuals. That's what constitutes a national identity, and it's an idea of identity that transcends, and this is what's important about it, territory. It doesn't matter who the land belongs to, it's a personal identity that is recognized. Now, the other option, and just to speak to Isser's quote from Renan about Switzerland, that's the territorial principle to the ultimate, to the nth degree. The Swiss have worked out what I call a cellular solution. When there's a nationalities problem in a canton, they'll split the canton, create a new cell, Basel and Basel-Land. And very recently in history, the French-speaking populace in the north of Canton Bern didn't want to stay in Bern, and they broke it. They are constituting a new canton, Jura, the newest canton in Switzerland. And they have another thing that I think is important when we consider how to solve the conundrums of the nation state, and that's consociationalism. This is, you know, we live in an Anglo-Saxon society with the Westminster model, that the winner organizes the Senate, organizes the House, 100%. In the Parliament of Westminster, you know, one vote and they run the country. They can even change the Constitution. Well, consociationalism says you build in protections for minorities all the way up. It's the system in Holland, Belgium, Switzerland. Switzerland is governed by a Conseil Fédéral of 7, and they have a magic formula, and they say there always must be a French Swiss and Italian Swiss on this council. Otherwise, if it were majority vote, they'd never make it. They couldn't get on. There always must be at least 2 Catholics, because it's a predominantly Protestant country. There always have to be at least 2 Social Democrats, because they're a minority up there. There have to be 2 liberals, Bürgerlich, and so forth, and at least 3 from the major cities. Zurich, Bern, and Genève get represented on the Swiss Federal Council. So you have what's called cross-cutting. Of course, the Zurich person will be a Protestant, or the Genève person is a Social Democrat. So, but you build in guarantees for minorities, and that's the way it's got to be in countries like Lebanon, it seems to me, Cyprus, which I think in the introduction I didn't say that's what Vamik knows well and has written on. He's a Turkish Cypriot, and I'll pass the ball to him.
Well, you told me just to speak only 2 minutes, so I have more time to speak. First of all, let me tell you about the reality and descriptions. I spent 6 years in Estonia after Soviet Empire collapsed, and they're building a nation state. There are 1.5 million people in Estonia. 500,000 are Russians.
500,000.
I spent 5 years in the Republic of Georgia. There are South Ossetians, Abkhazians, and Georgians. They're cutting each other's throats. Cyprus, there are Turks and Greeks. So this thing is that every nation state is different. They are not the same. It is how they are born. Kuwait. Kuwait was born by 3 families. They went there, Sabah family and the other 2, and they got some money from the water and pearls and so on, and they found oil. And there were Arabs and there were Iraqis, different ethnic groups came and money put them together. Now today, Kuwait, I spent 2 years in Kuwait after the invasion of Saddam, is a different nation sense. So let me put this way. Since I'm a senior Erik Erikson scholar, I have to make a reference to Erik Erikson. Erikson is the one that brought the so-called concept of identity to psychoanalysis. Freud only mentioned it 5 times. So it was Erikson who brought the concept of identity to psychoanalysis. It's very simple. Is a persistent sense of sameness you have. So we're talking about millions of people having a persistent sense of sameness. And so from childhood on, you develop your own identity. If you're a psychoanalyst and you look, identity is a subjective sense. If I'm a psychoanalyst, I make a map of you and say you have a self-representation. Okay? And we wear 2 layers of skins, clothes. One is my own identity. I'm George or I'm Fatima. And then we live under a tent, huge tent. Under it, there are millions of people in subgroups, but they also share this canvas of the tent. So the canvas of the tent is the identity of a large group. And we are not aware of it. When you walk in the street, you're not aware of it until somebody attacks it. Somebody spits on it. Somebody shakes it. At that time, my identity is become secondary. I become very, very much concerned with my canvas tent identity. But it is not really a nationhood. Because nationhood is more legal thing. Like if you go to Estonia, what is nationhood? The mother of all large group identities is ethnicity. And ethnicity, different religions, and so on. Some nations are very lucky. They have 90% same ethnicity. Then they're okay. But other, what we call nations, they are going to have balkanization. Mm-hmm. So it is, I think that we need to get the practical thing. Now, you and I think we are on the same tune. What happens to a large group? Tragedies occur or glories occur. And these tragedies, when tragedies occur, you become humiliated by the other. It is not like earthquake. When you are humiliated and you stay humiliated, you have to internalize it. You cannot be assertive. If you're assertive, I shoot you. So you cannot be assertive. You cannot express your aggression. If you live under the oppressor long enough, a century or 2, you identify with it. And suddenly you are a nation state. You have these psychological burdens. The main thing is that you cannot mourn. You cannot mourn your losses, your dignity. And that becomes what I call a chosen trauma. Every large group has a mental representation of history, maybe more than one, that under circumstances they reactivated. For example, when Yugoslavia collapsed and people say, who are we now? That is the most dangerous time. Who are we now? You regress. Who are we now? If you have a bad leader, says to you, let me reactivate your chosen trauma, mental representation of what had been done to you. So you have the entitlement ideology, irredentist ideology. You start going and killing people. I talk like that because I've been around for the last 30 years from country to country, and I'm ashamed of being a human being. People kill without blinking their eyes. And this is what is the reality. And they also go to their glories Saddam Hussein went to Saladin. Remember, not now, before he was saying Saladin. And Saladin was not even an Arab.
Yeah,
He was a Kurd. And so we have to expand the idea of these large groups and put more psychological processes in it in this day and age in order to be able to come up with new strategies to deal with human processes. So I just wanted to add some emotion to this discussion, that without emotions, we don't understand the power of it. Let me put it this way. It is just like you are doing something right now, you are not aware of it. I swear you are not aware of it. But everybody is doing something that I know you are doing. You are breathing. Were you aware that you were breathing? You were aware of your breathing without a cold? No, you were cold. But if, God forbid, if there's a fire in this room, God forbid, everybody becomes aware of breathing. Large group identity, whether you call it nation state, but basically ethnicity, not nation state, ethnicity, then you become aware of it, and you will be able to tolerate most severe masochism or perform most severe sadism in order to hold on that large group identity.
Isser, you wanted to talk about the emotions of the French Revolution?
Yeah, well, by the way, I would just throw out for possible later reference, if you take what is often considered the most boring nation state in the world, namely our northern neighbor in Canada, I think what's been going on there with Quebec and the whole issue of independence, secession, et cetera, is an interesting counterexample to all this, because it doesn't involve almost any of the criteria we've been talking about, and yet it threatened at a certain point to really rip that what seemed a very stable and exciting part. But I just put that out on the table for possible reference.
Doesn't it fit Deutsch's definition of social communication? They have a different social world.
Well, that's about it, but Canadians. It lacks all those other larger emotional, historic, ethnic ties. But anyway, what I wanted to focus on here was in the title of this workshop, the modern nation state, because with all due respect to the salient comments that were made by my colleagues, whether to bureaucratic absolutism of the 17th century, or not to mention Ibn Khaldun, who is, as you said, talking about tribal societies, really, in a sense. The modern nation state is something distinct. I won't go so far as say it begins with the French Revolution, but certainly the French Revolution is a crucial moment in the definition and articulation of a modern nation state. And what I'd like to do is just take a couple of minutes to talk about some of what went on there. First of all, this is the most fascinating thing. In 1789, it was assumed by the revolutionaries that the nation already existed. The nation was synonymous with the people. And they would use these terms pretty much interchangeably. Most often they talk about the people, but they would also call it the nation, meaning the aggregate of all the people in France. That's the French nation. The nation was assumed to exist, and then at the very same moment it becomes the repository of sovereignty. And it seems to me sovereignty is one of the crucial issues here. As you then move forward for the next 200 years. The nature of sovereignty, what constitutes sovereignty, who is part of the sovereign body, and so forth. That seems to me at the root the question of the modern nation. Now, the French Revolution at its inception is highly inclusive. But very quickly, this supposedly unified people/nation becomes extremely divided. They divide first over a kind of fusion of moral and political issues. Basically, good citizens and bad citizens. The bad citizens are labeled as aristocrats or egoists, various terms of convenience, and this quickly it develops into a Manichaean view of their own nation, that their own nation consists of a mass of ordinary people who are virtuous, or at least potentially virtuous, and a smaller minority of people, indistinguishable on by every other criteria that we mentioned, who are morally defective because they're self-interested egoists. They don't embrace and work for the common weal. So the distinction between good citizens and in effect bad citizens becomes obviously one of the main themes and issues in the development of the French Revolution, and it becomes a question of inclusion and exclusion. And as the exclusion mounts, there's a kind of blowback, there's resistance, a rejectionist position about the revolution develops, to use a contemporary term. There are rebellions. It even reaches the state of an extraordinarily violent civil war, which takes on the earmarks of a guerrilla war and therefore becomes all the more brutal and violent. So this is what happened to the presumed nation, which was the repository of sovereignty. Inclusion, battles over inclusion and exclusion. What's the end result of this? The end result, a lot of people think at the time, is that there really is not one France but two Frances. A France that in effect accepts the project, let's put it that way, and the new values of the revolution, and those benighted people, whether elites or ordinary people, who have not accepted this, and who are benighted and backward and possibly even irredeemable. So that's where in the 19th century things seem to stand. It's not a well-integrated, harmonious polity, and there's no agreement over the most basic issues of sovereignty. For example, should it be a republic or not? This is a contentious issue for the better part of a century, and only gets resolved really in about 1880. With the Third Republic, and one could argue that it's not even resolved then, that Vichy France in 1940 is yet another reopening of this question. So there's that. Now, let me just take 2 more minutes to talk about let's call it the international side of this picture, because it's the relationship of different groups and different nations that is part of the essential problem of nationhood and nations. The French Revolution, its distinctiveness to begin with, from this perspective, its distinctiveness is that it is going to be peaceable. The French revolutionaries consider that they are going to mark off a new course in human history by renouncing aggression and by being essentially a peaceful, rational, and therefore peaceful nation. So they issue a declaration of peace to the world, literally renouncing wars of aggression and the intrigues of princes, which had been, which is their view of what the past consisted of. Down to and including the Treaty of Westphalia, by the way, which was a sort of a devil's bargain of sorts, allocating the fate of masses of people according to what the rulers thought should be done, and not to mention religious differences. So a declaration of peace to the world, and moreover, and this might surprise you, they decide they're debating what kind of army to have. And they decide that instead of creating a mass, large citizens' army, they will actually go for a small professional army because they anticipate that France will be at peace. Okay, you move ahead just a couple of years. France is at war. At first, there's a great mobilization. And this is one of the hallmarks of the new, of the nationalism, so to speak, of the modern nation state, the ability to mobilize masses of people to fight and die for the state because they're fighting a defensive war. The Marseillaise, if you look at the language of that, is extremely bloody-minded and violent, defensive and aggressive. Both. There's a lot of aggression there, and very quickly the whole situation changes. The French become missionaries of liberty in other countries, are of course often reviled and resisted for that reason, and soon they're referring to themselves as La Grande Nation, the great nation, which is going to take under its wing basically almost all of Western continental Europe. From the Low Countries, including through Switzerland, northern Italy, and possibly even all of Italy, and the western part of Germany. That's La Grande Nation with its sister republics. So I mean, this is an extraordinary development, which reveals that, in a sense, for a set of particular reasons and doctrines, the French are now behaving as the traditional powers of Europe used to behave, and are doing, in a sense, a better job of it. I'll stop there.
Okay, let me comment psychodynamically. When you used the term Manichaean view, virtue, and then these are the evil, morally defective.
Morally defective.
Yeah, that's a binary.
Yes,
that's a binary of thought, and we have another term for it, splitting. We're the good ones, and these people are the evil ones. All right. Giorgio, you wanted to...
It seems to me that during the last 30, 40 minutes, the emphasis has been more on the nation than on the state. Well, actually, some of you sound as like escape from the state, the Swiss escaped from the state and created something which is not a nation state. Federalist system failed to be nation state in the classical term. By the way, you hit upon a very nice political science notion, that one of consociational democracy, whose definition is a political system where minorities are heard and sometimes have a veto power over the decision of majorities. The United States is consociational. Why is it consociational?
Senate.
Look at the Senate. A coalition of states involving 3 or 4% of the population can beat a coalition of states involving 60% of the population.
That one vote from Virginia made a big difference this week.
Yeah.
So it's majority rule in organizing.
However, what I found as a common link, and by the way, it is also part of the presentation, the leaflet which we all have. Let me quote, how individual psychology can have far-reaching consequences as it evolves via culture and political action into reflecting the wishes of the polity on a mass scale. And here, coming back to the thing I said in my first intervention, if we go to analyze what's happening in continental Europe now, which is making intercontinental Europe an animal totally different from the United States, the differences are already so enormous that they don't belong into the same family. I'll show it in a minute. Possibly psychology and to a great extent anthropology are going to be helpful to put some order on this question. And I am relying here on the great work of the grand old lady of English anthropology, Mary Douglas, who has been analyzing comparatively very different political communities, these two questions. The great social question are, who am I, to what kind of group do I belong, and what should I do Are there many or few prescriptions I am expected to obey? Now, if you analyze different models of behavior, national or nation-state-wise, we discover that in some places there are groups with strong boundaries, decisions made for the whole, and then other nations where the boundaries between groups are weak, and therefore the individual prevails. And also we will see that there are cultural organizations with many prescriptions one must follow, and some which are very few. Let me give you an example. A typical case of weak boundaries between groups and very few prescriptions is the United States, which is really individual competition, individualism, capitalism, the culture of the market. And the individual is central, and you don't need many prescriptions except an organization which prevents people from depriving you of your rights and especially of your property. But let's go back to Europe. There the opposite is true. The groups prevails over the individuals, and there are many prescriptions. Why? Because it's still a hierarchical organization which must justify hierarchies by allotting roles very precisely to all components, and risk is spread all over the collectivity, whereas here in the United States risk is something individuals take when they are out in the market. By the way, these two different conceptions, this is very important, they've given way to alternative operational definitions of equality. Everybody is in favor of equality. You know, after constitutionalization and representative government, who doesn't want equality? However, there is an ocean of difference between legal equality, which is the mark of Europe, vis-à-vis equality of opportunities, which is the landmark of the United States. Legal equality means that the state congeals, crystallizes the certification system. You have rights, everybody is treated the same by the judge and by the tax collector, but if you are born a carpenter in a small town, your children will be carpenters in the same small town. The refusal, if I may say so, I am venturing on difficult territory because this is pure American history, but it's the refusal of the pursuit of happiness, which is the total freedom of movement, both social and geographical. Huh? Equality of opportunities, pay attention, it's a very strange type of equality. It's the right to be different. It's a race. Life is a long race, a long gallop. You start possibly from the same point. That's why the United States always puts so much money on education. And then you start run, and there are chronometers at the end. You are first, second, or third. So the equality of opportunity is the right to be different according to your own merit and your activity. Then there is a third model of behavior which is important to us, which is the model of very strong group boundaries, very few rules, which is the model of the rebels, the Puritans, the Pilgrims here, and the anarchists in Europe. People who are against any form of power of individual over others, who really think that everybody should be equal, and especially nobody should have more power than others. And I have a very nice, I found the other day a very nice quote from one of the American presidents I like best, who is Jackson, Andrew Jackson. All government is evil, including the democratic kind, and beyond the administration of justice, should leave the rest of society to the voluntary principle. I mean, you know, this, if you consider Europe with this kind of a position, they have nothing in common. What has happened is that the rebels here found that they couldn't survive. For a century they went along with the individualists, the capitalists. But then when the monopolies became more important than political power in determining differences among the people. It is the post-Jacksonian which created the anti-monopoly law. Whereas here, and again, consider Europe, just the opposite. We are now feebly starting to talk about doing something about monopolies. Huh?
Thank you for the comparative view. Giorgio, I have real difficulty with your dismissing Switzerland as not a nation state. You set up this definition, you know.
But according to the classical definition.
Well, then there's something wrong with the definition.
You know, federal systems are federals because there are minorities who don't like each other.
Nation states make a difference, and the difference, just to list two institutions, military service and education. Okay, in Schaffhausen, canton of Switzerland, they speak German, just like across the border. It's the canton that looks like an amoeba, you know, inside Germany. But it's an entirely different democratic militia system. I mean, you know this in Switzerland, as opposed to the Prussian army or German military service. It's a different education system, and they didn't have the two world wars. It makes a big difference.
The Swedes too, for that matter, and they are a very unitary state.
Okay. Let me say the chair will entertain, we'll have another contribution by Shukri, but the chair will entertain interventions and questions from the group.
Yes, I would like to.
Something back here? Okay. Can we take some? Yeah, all right.
Quick comment. One, these are all very much focused on the modern aspect of this, because I think this is where...
Would you do us the favor of giving your name?
Yeah, I'm David Kirkpatrick. I'm a writer at Fortune magazine. I write about technology. I'm also a very frequent attender. But anyway, I wanted to just note, as I often do in these sessions, there are technological evolutional issues that are happening that really change some of these issues. I mean, there is a whole issue of identity happening now on a transnational basis, which I think is happening faster than most people realize, where people are beginning to identify themselves as a non-national person. And I don't know where that goes, but I wanted to throw that out as one point. But the other thing that I think is even more important is I was hoping that the panel would talk more about the Israeli-Palestinian situation, because it, to me, still remains a central conflict in the world today for many, many reasons. Even despite Korea, et cetera, this is the central thing from which so much hinges. And I think looking at it psychologically, I'd love to hear you talk, and I wanted to suggest two different ways of thinking about it, the psychology of the Israelis and the psychology of the United States in addition, because, and I don't know what's going on in Israel, but one thing that occurred to me, if you know, the individuals constantly seeking the resolution of conflicts in their personality, you know, Israel doesn't seem to have done that to the degree that other nations perhaps have done, or certainly not to the degree individuals seem to seek to do it. And I was wondering if that might be because immigration was such a big part of the creation of Israel that people were so happy to be there, they didn't really feel like they needed to resolve anything because all they wanted to do was be happy they were there, right? Okay. But is that going to continue? One question I would have. But then on the side of the United States, just walking here, something really interesting happened. I was walking across 86th Street, and I bought this book sitting on this, which hasn't, I don't think, even been published yet. Jimmy Carter, Palestine, Peace Not Apartheid. I haven't read any reviews of it. Maybe you all have. But anyway, the fact that a U.S. president has just written this book is a major shift in U.S. dialogue on this topic, because there's been a taboo in the U.S. society in addressing, you know, in a nuanced way, what the multifarious points of view are on this issue. And so I just want to, that's it. I'm not going to go on.
Okay.
That's what I'd like to answer to.
All right. Look, what we're going to do, Shukri will get the first answer to you, but I saw a lot of hands up. Let me connect three questions, and then we'll take them in order. Yes, sir. Tell us your name.
Larry Cutler, retired.
Great. Okay.
This question of the nation state, and is it one or the two? Now, somebody mentioned the Franco-Prussian War. If you take the Franco-Prussian War, at first it's the French against the Prussians. But what happens is when the French no longer wanted to fight the Prussians, in fact, the French government was more for letting the Prussians do what they want. The arose the Paris Commune. So there you have two faces to it. Or even in Germany in 1890, whenever Bismarck brought those laws, that was because the Social Democratic Party and the German workers were threatening. And even though there were all these laws against the German workers, they knew they had to give them benefits, you know. And, you know, because you mentioned about how a lot of things go on that we don't even know they're going on. Well, there are two parts to every country, which will always be as long as there is capitalism. Because there's not just one nation state where everybody has the same goals. People don't have the same goals, or they are confused into thinking they have the same goals, like even in Iraq, but they don't have the same goals because they live different ways. You are something different from what you seem to think you are. So that this nation state thing is actually a creation of capitalism, you know, but it's not eternal. And it's not even now one body. And Switzerland is a small thing. You can't compare something like Switzerland with, say, the United States or Russia, you know, or China. That's why they weren't in the war. They were so small. Same with Sweden. They didn't want to be in the war. And they had to be very careful so they wouldn't be in the war.
Another question. Your name is?
My name is Polakov. I'm a professor of Law Institute of Technology. My area of expertise, artificial intelligence.
Would you repeat your name? I didn't.
Name Polakov. P-O-L-Y-A-K-O-V. You can tell because I understand you know Russian.
No, I
You don't because you are from.
I worked in Russia a long time, and I don't know Russian.
He's from Cyprus.
I'm from Cyprus.
He's from everywhere.
I don't know Cypriot language.
Number one, I create emotion in scientific definition. But in this case, I think that it is only way how to solve the problem. And my proposition is like this: nation is a group of people who are ready to sacrifice their life in main interest of the group. So this is emotion definition, and I think that this is what we have in real life. It's number one. Number two, we try to solve very complicated problem, worldwide problems. It is very difficult, but we have the best way how to do this: decomposition. Don't try to solve something what is very complicated. Present it as a chain of simple things and solve each one separately. This is all way, and I think that it is the most productive way. It's not much. And about emotion, I'm sorry, I would like to share with you my personal story. When I was enrolled in school, first grade school, it was in Russia, and my teacher asked me what kind of nationality I am. I told him Russian, and I put it Russian. Later, I get information that I am not Russian, I am Jew. And people ask me, how do you know that you're Jew? And my question is, Hitler told me. And I became Jew as soon as I got information, and I realized what is Hitler all about, what is Hitler, German, and what is Second World War all about. So it is emotion part of my identity. So this emotion I get. And I'm sorry, maybe I am last one.
Yeah.
I think that most of the problems are artificial, like between Israel and Palestine and Arab countries. Somebody, and we know who is interested in this conflict. Personally.
Who's that?
Who is it?
Who?
I cannot tell you name, but I can tell you just name of groups, not name
Groups.
of
Who are the groups?
Russia. In some way, France in Europe. And I can continue this list, and I can explain you why.
Okay.
And I had very interesting personal experience. Several years ago, I got lost. I was driving and I got lost. And I asked one guy how to get the place I'm looking for. He showed me very nice guy. We had very nice conversation. And suddenly he told me, listen, you're Jew, but I am Palestinian. And we can discuss not just direction, but we have, he told me, I have a feeling that we can discuss much more problems and questions.
Thank you, Paul Yakov. We have now 3 questions, one like attention to the Palestinian-Israeli problem, and you're going to speak to it, Vamik's going to speak to it. We have the Commune of Paris of 71, Isser, and we have a suggestion, and I think it's a very important one, that persecution creates a sense of identity. It forms it.
Yeah.
So,
first, I would like to say that it's true, we are talking about modern nation-state, Professor Woloch. However, you cannot really discuss the modern nation-state in the Middle East without talking about Islam, historical experiences, and also without taking into account the tribal nature of many Arab countries, the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, believe it or not, after the lead of Saddam Hussein was lifted from there, Iraq showed its tribal structure. Jordan is a tribal state. Maybe the Levantine area, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, and Egypt added to that or not, but the majority of Arab countries are still tribal. And we cannot ignore that. We cannot ignore the Islamic background. We cannot ignore the conflicts that arise from the introduction of new European concepts which are contradictory to Islam in many ways, the nation state, the nationality, the secularism, and democracy. In many ways, they contradict the nature of Islam and the conception of Islam, which I can talk about later on. However, I would like to go back to one of my favorite subjects, my painful subject, which is Palestine is not the question, the division between Palestine. You individuals, we can talk about it nicely, and I have many Jewish friends, and they are brothers to me, not only friends. But that's not the issue. The issue, when I came in 1976 to Harvard to study, to get my PhD, I identified myself as Israeli. But just like Hitler made you realize that Jews, the massacres committed against my people, the Palestinians, by Israel daily, made me realize that I'm Palestinian more than anything else. That's true. This is the painful side of it. I see that every day, and I know it shouldn't be compared that way. But when people are massacred every day, when the Palestinians are extending their hand, it is true struggle between two national movements, the Palestinian and the Israeli, the Zionism and the Palestinian national movement. Although there is perception of united Arab world, there is no united Arab world. There are nations in that, nations, tribes, whatever you want to call them, and they want to define themselves, and the Palestinians are seeking to define themselves. In 1988, the Palestinians recognized for the first time the right of Israel to exist by Yasser Arafat. Israel turned that down till the appearance of the great, whom I consider one of the greatest leaders of this century, Yitzhak Rabin, who really had this strategic shift in his mind, in his vision, and he was willing to he was willing to recognize the rights of the other side, but he was assassinated, unfortunately. And with him, many things were killed, were assassinated as well. The future of the Israelis and the Palestinians was put on hold, at least for a long time. Now, after 1967, I know that before 1967 there were many negotiations between Palestinians and Israelis and Arabs, Jamal Abdel Nasser included, to have a mutual recognition. And Israel would have loved to have within the 67 borders a nation state recognized by all Arab countries. In 2002, there was a summit in Beirut, which also suggested recognition of the state of Israel by all Arab countries in return for the creation of a Palestinian state within the 67 borders. But so far this hasn't happened. Why? I don't understand. I mean, I asked many of my Jewish friends, why is that happening? They say, well, with the food comes the appetite. In other words, now we are the occupier, and therefore we have no reason to relinquish it. It's a matter of balance of power, unfortunately. It's a matter of balance of power. The Israelis have the power, and they have unqualified support. Let's be frank about it. They have unqualified support by the United States, whether it's Republican or Democrats. Therefore, I think the change of the Congress now will not make much difference as far as the Palestinian issue is concerned. Because whether it is Democrat or it is Republicans, they all support without any qualifications the state of Israel, any government of Israel, and that's unfortunate. I think unless that is changed, nothing will move. The killing will continue. The massacre that happened 2 days ago, when 18 children and women were massacred, Israel apologized about that, of course, but that's not the first time, and I'm afraid it's not going to be the last time that will happen. Unless the balance of power is changed, I don't think that anything will happen, unfortunately. Even with the change of the Congress, which I was happy for internal reasons. For the war in Iraq, I think this will change, but not for the Palestinian thing, because the unqualified support comes from the United States through every Congress, whether it is a Democrat or Republican. And that is a given now in the United States, and as long as that doesn't change, we are not going to see much change in the Middle East.
Yeah, Vamik, you want to comment?
Do you recognize Israel?
I'm an Israeli citizen.
Yeah, but your counterpart, Palestinian, no one recognizes this country. Member of UN. So what do you want?
What?
Professor Polyakov, we're going to get another discussion over here from Professor Volkan.
Before I say anything about Israel and Palestine, I want to tell you that I'm not making certain things up. I was involved in from 1979 to 1986. After Camp David, there was a process which is not known much, under the auspices of American Psychiatric Association, with the blessing of Israeli government, Egyptian government, later Palestinians, and American government, to do unofficial dialogues between very high-level Arabs and Israelis. And I had the opportunity, honor, whatever, I was involved in it, and I chaired these meetings during the last 3 years. So, okay. And worked with Jimmy Carter to some extent. So there are so many aspects of it. One is theoretical. That is, I've been involved in many conflicted areas. After a while, enemies become identical. Now, I need to explain that. I don't mean that allies become like Hitler or do those things. I'm talking about certain psychological processes. Number two, I want to say to you, after September 11, there has been not one single process of bringing Western world and so-called Islamic world some big shots to have a series of dialogues. None. There are, I think, I'm sorry, I forget your...
Kirkpatrick.
You are very on the dot that Arab-Israeli-Palestinian situation has to be resolved in certain ways as part of changing the whole world. We are under absolute regression. And regression makes things very, very bad. Now, I'll speak about one part of it and then come to Jimmy Carter. I had the honor of being the inaugural Yitzhak Rabin Fellow in Israel. I was a guest of Israelis, spent 4 months. This was the 50th anniversary of birth of Israel. And Abraham Burke, who was the head of parliament then, whom I liked very much, invited me to go to the ceremony. And that was there's nothing that Israelis don't talk about, by the way. You go to University of Tel Aviv and they talk about everything. There's nothing they don't talk about. So this meeting at Mount Herzl, it was very, very moving for me and very important, and I'd like to share it with you. They had 12 people, never mind the religious aspects of it, representing different parts of Israel. And the main talk was that nationhood, I'm using your word, Peter, it's a synthetic country. It is how do you bring an Israeli nationhood while you have so many different aspects, like you have 1 million Russians, 80 million Ethiopians. When 80,000.
80,000.
I'm sorry, 80,000. I didn't. Maybe it was my thing.
No.
For example, after I left, Second Intifada started, and one day on television I saw the killings after a suicide bombing at one of the discos, and I was looking at the marble, and there was some blood, and I started crying because our house was just looking at that disco. And I felt so much for these kids. Most of them were Russian kids, Russian Israelis. And when I heard that religious section of Israelis would not allow those kids to be buried in Jewish cemeteries, that's what I'm talking about. There are so many splits in Israel that has to be mended. And I'm not saying this. I'm talking about Burke's words. It's not original with me. And this is one of the issues that has to be mended in Israel so that projections become lessened. And it is very difficult sometimes to talk about it, since I am neutral and a friend of everybody, so I can talk and bring this to attention. Now, this thing that Jimmy Carter is writing, I have not read it yet, but since I was a part of INN for 10 years under Jimmy Carter, it's called International Negotiation Network. I know the man, and in a sense he's crazy writing this book, but if we take him as willing to help, I think that's his motivation, then it may stir up things and start a dialogue again. Dialogues are missing. It's so simple. You dialogue, and there are dialogues. I don't mean dialogues. You know, there's the American AIDS. When I was there, they increased the number from 60 to 80 people. But they give you $1,000, they give you $10,000. And a little bit over here, a little bit over there. There's no, I just keep telling them, just stop building 10 bombs, good bombs, and give that money to me. And then we start open a dialogue. There's no dialogue going on. And one of the strategies is that maybe by this book, which may also increase a lot of reaction, negative reactions, which I'm sure it will, if it leads to the possibility that somehow somebody will start a dialogue again, And that's what is missing in Middle East. And that's what is missing also between so-called Islamic world and Western world.
Isser, do you want to address?
I would just add to this that I didn't bring Renan up to display my erudition. I mean, I knew that this issue was going to come up. I think putting on the table the concept of forgetting is extremely important when and if dialogue ever resumes. This is not a category that one ordinarily thinks of, but to me that's an extremely it's an extremely suggestive seed that was planted over 100 years ago about these kinds of questions. The need on both sides here to forget, and also ultimately that for all the dialogue and brokering that might go on, there has to be an element of consent in the consolidation of these two nations side by side, which makes it very difficult. But I think that's the template. The other thing I would venture to contribute here is to put out two sort of what have become catchwords for most historians working on these kinds of issues. I don't mean on contemporary issues, but on historical issues of this sort, about nations and conflict among and within nations. These two terms are, one is the title of a very famous book. It's called Imagined Communities, with the argument being really that the modern nation state really is, in various ways, an imagined community. And the other concept, very current among historians, is the notion of, again, it's the title of a very well-known book, The Invention of Tradition. The Invention of Tradition, which has a particular application when it comes to national identity. I mean, for example, you could point out that even in one of the oldest, most venerable, and most well-established nation states, France, it took an awfully long time to reach consensus. And, for example, July 14th as the national holiday was not recognized and celebrated as such until the 1880s. I believe the Marseillaise was not adopted as the official national anthem, sort of in a permanent, ongoing way, until then. The embodiment, the symbolic embodiment, the image that embodies French nationhood, Marianne, the image, the statues, and so forth, again, was something that only came late in the 19th century. The forging of a nation internally is very difficult and often involves invented traditions. And I guess my point of juncture with the contemporary is if traditions can be invented, they can also be sort of deconstructed and consigned to the trash heap too, if they've lost their function and usefulness, if they're an impediment to a world that one wants to live in.
Chair, we'll take some more questions. You had one. Give us your name, please.
Yes, I'm Sybil Schwarzenbach. I'm professor of philosophy at CUNY at City University. I'm just listening to you, and the stress right now is on ethnicity. And I guess, having grown up in the 60s, sort of with an idea that we can get beyond our ethnicity and recognize despite it. I'm just wondering if, for those of us who haven't read our Freud in a long time, this regression could be looked at a little bit, elaborate a little bit more what you mean by the regression, such that people wall up and don't talk and don't see beyond their own fixed identities, because it seems to me you have to get out of this somehow, otherwise it's going to.
Sybil, let me add another category that Isser just raised. Imagined community means fantasy. It's a psychoanalytic category.
Also, I think there need to be some common social institutions. It's not just fantasy. I think it's too imaginary.
There's a fantasy of the American frontier, which
which was a disaster.
Runs American politics and so forth. Okay, I'll take another couple. Yes.
I've heard your reference to the demise of dialogue. And, Sharon Gerard. I'm retired. I have an interest in philosophy. So the concepts of dialogue and forgetting. What I missed is attention to the concept of forgiving. I'm thinking specifically of Hannah Arendt and dialogue in a public space, the criticality of a public space and dialogue in it, but coupled with the notion of forgetting. And I would have thought that in a psychoanalytic context, that might come up. What would it mean to forgive in the Palestinian, Israeli, or in the Turkish genocide?
Perhaps with reference to Ireland also, where
we saw it in South Africa. What would it mean to extrapolate and run with that in these other countries?
Let me take one more question. Couple, come on down. Well, one.
My name is Seth Kolberg. I'm a biologist, and trying to make it short. From a biologist's point of view, we're dealing with problems of altruism. That is, people are doing these things which to them are more precious than peace because they think they're defending a group or defending themselves as part of a group. That is to say, even tribal warriors from a biological point of view are altruists. They're risking their own lives and their own capacity to have children for the group that they're part of. And this leads into, there are many, many problems of altruism. In a way, altruism trumps individualism, but then when you get problems of altruism, whether it's religious or national or ethnic or tribal or community, it can be a problem. And that leads into the notion of all of the sub-national entities that are warrior. You can make the argument that one of the key determinants is not so much the question of nation state in Iraq or someplace, but the assault on the honor of people and the whole psychoanalytical aspect of honor and defense of honor and what honor means and how that can all be corrupted in places like Africa and there's many books to be written about. And then the notion of how shocking from our point of view, say just take the last couple of years in many places in the world, the depth and degree of violence that people are willing to organize politically and publicly in order to get relatively small gains, whether it's Yugoslavia or Rwanda or Lebanon or in Iraq, where people will just say, well, our politics are to kill 100 people a day and 30 pay attention. And then, so thinking about all of that in the environment of really anti-enlightenment that's been ascended for the last 20 years all over the world, from the Hindu Nationalist Party to the Israeli Nationalist Party to the United States Nationalist Party to many places in the world, Islamic Nationalist parties, etc. I'm thinking of some practical idea, and one practical question that arises is, what is it that distinguishes between velvet revolutions like Czechoslovakia that allow amicable splitting and violent revolutions? And I'm thinking in terms of the radio that was used so effectively in Rwanda to organize the mass murders. In other words, let's say we see someplace where political discourse looks like it's frankly going to become genocidal. We understand that there are people that for months are calling other people bugs. And they have to be exterminated to protect the health developing the security of the body politic, the normal rhetoric. There, it seems there might be a place for a fire break, for some sort of
Could I ask you to turn your phones off, please? Thanks.
Anyway, so so in other words, I made a bleak picture, and then I started to try to think of some possible practical ground in terms of places where there might be a little space between the dominants.
Good. All right, we have gentleman in black. Jack. Your name is?
Malcolm Fenton. I'm a science teacher at the Dalton School here in Manhattan. I was interested in what the gentleman said over there about deconstructing the nation state, because it seems to me we've spent a lot of time saying what the psychology of the nation state or of nationalism is, but what could be done to reduce that and reduce this sense that people seem to have within them, the drive within them to identify themselves as a group and to identify the other as being somehow inferior and not worthwhile. I'm British by origin, and I've seen a lot of good things happen in my nation where originally, with of course the British are famous for this, for viewing themselves as superior to everybody, and over time, I think that increased travel, the internet, and the media have allowed British people to see other people in profoundly different ways, and it has really changed British society. I know that Blair brought Britain into Iraq, but the majority of the people didn't want to be there. And I wonder if perhaps we couldn't direct the conversation also towards what's hopeful here. There are many problems in the world. But to what extent modern technology and communications and a more global view of the world can direct us towards less conflict?
You can, but I'm going to take one more.
Hi, my name is Sandy Brzezinski. I'm a financial consultant, and I'm 2 days back from Israel. And I have a short statement that I think that the ambivalence, the violence that I saw there, this was my first trip, was astounding. I was there during the thing that you mentioned. I mean, it happened while I was there. First they killed 2 people. The ambivalence to what's going on, how do you change that psychology? What do you do to make people care that this actually happened? Because I found at the David Citadel Hotel, they were just interested in their food and their tourism, and if their guide showed up on time, and nobody was interested in it. It was a sideshow.
Now, I was interested in both your questions, and the question of honor is very important in the Middle East, as well humiliation. I think the Arab nations are feeling humiliated, defeated by a small country like Israel, being really have no way whatsoever in world politics, weigh nothing, and they could not for 55 years, 58 years, could not liberate Palestine or even get close to that. And that's humiliation. And in terms of the new technologies, they feel that their culture is being assaulted through globalization. They consider the culture of globalization that's prevailing in the world, whereas from English or French point of view, it's in accordance with their development, with their technological development, with their culture. In the Arab world, they consider it to be globalization of culture. Culture of globalization becomes globalization of their culture in terms of, in many aspects. And some of them, of course, there is a sharp argument going on, just like I said earlier, there is a question of identity. The globalization thing is adding to that debate, that hot debate in the Arab world, in the Arab and Islamic world. What sides of the technology can we learn without affecting our own culture or without although this is, of course, every culture will change. Eventually, culture is a constant change. What Islam, when it started, Islam was not Islam. It was the Quran, and really major parts of Islamic culture was based on Greek thought, on Iranian thought, on Indian thought, and Christian thought, and Jewish thought. No question about it. They acquired all these factors and built their great empire, which lasted for many, many years and was leader in scientific achievements for 500 years. But today's Islamic world is being threatened, feels very threatened by Israel, by the United States, by the Western cultures in general. They are very vulnerable, and therefore, when you are vulnerable, you are defensive, and when you are defensive, you fight back, and you don't really accept much of what the other side is offering you. That's what's happening in the Arab and Islamic world. Now, to your question, how do we resolve this? I think as long as there is no realization, I think in the United States, in the administration, in the Congress in particular, because I think the administration usually, even George Bush will realize, will recognize, maybe not Cheney, but George Bush will recognize, and he talked about two-state solution. I hope this dream will come true. This is the only solution. It's the only solution that will two democratic states, and we know the principle of democracy, that two democratic states never fight each other. That's universal. Give me an example, one example of two democratic states that fought each other. You will not find anyone. You will never find two democratic states who fought each other. So if we can establish this principle of two democratic states, and the Palestinian state, I have written about that in 1988, that the Palestinian nation is the first nation to become democratic other than Israel in the Middle East. The first nation. They have all the components of Palestinian, they have all the components to become a democratic state, full-fledged democratic state. Israel has great democracy, better than the United States. I can tell you that. I can tell you that. I'm very proud of that democracy. I'm against the occupation. I'm against the oppression. But Israel has great democracy. The late Edward Said used to tell me that he could publish his articles in Israel easier than he could publish them in the United States. Yeah, it's amazing. And Israel has so much to offer. Israel has so many positive things to offer. In social services, nobody can compete with Israel. In agriculture, in education, in the academia in Israel, I studied there. In medical services, I think they can be example for the world. But why do they have to be example for the occupation and oppression of other people? The only explanation that they are insecure nation. Despite all the strength, the military strength, they are very insecure nation still. They are in a state of formation now. Because Israel can offer so much to the world and to the Middle East, and they are not. Instead, they are offering miserable situation, unfortunately. I think Rabin was the only leader, Peres to some extent, but Peres is too weak. Rabin was going in that direction. And I'm hoping, I'm praying to God that some leader will come up, but that will not happen as long as the Congress is in the composition that it is now, whether it is democratic or...
Do you want to answer Professor Schwarzenbach?
Well, first of all, when I said dialogue, I don't mean Bush's people or some people getting into dialogue, so I'm accustomed to it. Just very briefly, dialogue under psychologically informed third party. We developed a technique called tree model, and a team of psychoanalysts from three major branches.
First, it's also regression.
I'm going to tell about. I tell you because I want to tell about dialogue. Psychoanalysts plus other psychological types, historians, political scientists, diplomats. We had a person who was Jimmy Carter's Assistant Secretary of State level, very high level diplomat, very high level historian, and supported the very high level psychoanalyst. So we had a team, we worked for almost 25 years. And dialogue meant like psychoanalysis. You go in, you do diagnosis, you bring the opposite people, not the president or prime minister, but one level down, so they can talk. And you talk for 2-3 years, every 3 months, and then they come up with their own strategies. Who am I to tell people? Like psychoanalysis, I don't give advice. They come up, and we did this in many different places. We started with Arab Israelis, but we did not have the experience at that time. We had experience in other places. So when I say dialogue, I don't mean politicians talking to each other. Number two, there are 20 signs of regression. I have written about them. We see them in America. After September 11, Mr. Bush's 90 people, Freud know about it. But if a leader cannot differentiate where fantasy ends and where reality starts, then you have a split within the country, which you said. And then minor differences, chosen traumas. I mean, you can read them. So there are these signs and so on. And so that the dialogue means keeping in mind these kind of knowledge that now we are slowly putting out, not only from psychoanalysis, but from diplomacy also, because the team writing in their own ways, that you open up a dialogue and then you feed into people. This has to be done in this day and age. Now, why some people in regression, they do better? By the way, technology will not help. You know what Iraqis did. They used technology with fundamentalist religion to do the worst things. Logics and emotions, psychological processes are different. Of course, technology will help if you have a leader. Leaders become extremely important. I'm going to go to South Africa next week, and it is the 10th anniversary of Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and talking about forgiveness. Those people who went through that thing, they are all re-traumatized. Nothing helped those individuals. A few of them got. But what Desmond Tutu did was brought the large group mourning in surface. And instead of doing forgetting, they put both sides. Most monuments only have one side. They are in the service of forgetting. Desmond Tutu's, I know the guy, so he's like a street kid. So he did it in a different way. But there is no possibility to forgive anybody until you do your own mourning. Without doing your mourning, you are not going to forgive. Either you stay in a victimized situation, or whenever you have opportunity, you are going to blast it off. So we have collected a lot of data about how large groups function with each other. And that it's one more thing, biology. See, there is such a thing. For example, there's an example on Aberfan village in Welsh. A cold slurry comes and kills all the kids in the school and the teachers. But it's not done by enemies. It is by nature. Who do you get angry at? You get angry at God or whatever. And within 5 years, those mothers who did not lose children, statistically speaking, they got pregnant more. Within 5 years, there was a biosocial regeneration. It is opposite to what happened in Belarus, for example. And when there are issues like Palestine and so on, then whatever you do, your backbone, society's backbone tissue is broken. You get into psychobiological degeneration. And so that it's impossible to get out of it until somebody comes and helps you to mourn not only your honor, everything. And this is why that we need to, in this day and age, we need to find ways to find more dialogues, the type of I described, in order to deal with this kind of world, or be lucky enough have people who are leaders different way. One example, and I'll stop. Mandela, since I'm going to go to see them, Mandela, 1 month before they were going to get into power, Mandela and his people are sitting in a room, and telephone rings and Mandela goes out. 15 minutes later he returns, and they say to him, oh, while you were gone, we did something fantastic. He says, what did you do? He says, well, these whites, Afrikaners, we want to get rid of their national anthem and put one national anthem for the blacks. And Mandela says, you cannot do that. You're going to hurt their identity. See how there are leaders like that. Right. Today, if you go to South Africa, they have two national anthems. Time to play. It is the idea of time to play. And it disturbs me a great deal that so much money goes on, is wasted because some bombs fall in the water. They kill nobody. It's useless. And there's not enough money to change the way that we have to look at the world affairs from now on, because it's unending. We are regressing so badly. And so I don't know what to do about it, but there are methodologies and more information how large groups play with each other, badly or non-bad.
Vamik, just to clarify, did you say Bishop Tutu is like a street cat?
It's the kid.
Street kid? Okay.
Kid. His eyes are very light. And they tried 12 more times to do Truth and Reconciliation Commission kind of thing in other countries. How many of them worked? None.
Is that right?
None. It worked to some degree only in South Africa because of Desmond Tutu's personality organization. He was able to absorb it. So it is not so simple. It is like an onion. You have many layers, and every conflicted area is just like a different patient. They have their own psychological thing. We have to open up and then develop strategies. And this is a time that we need to put psychology in international relations. European Union getting together, and I've been talking to European Union people, trying to say, you have legal things, political things, but you don't have a psychological thing to bring all these different identities together. And about 4 months ago, we had an experience in Budapest. And now I agree with European Union. They should not bring psychology in it. Why? We had people from different countries, Italians and French and the Hungarians and Austrians and Germans and so on. And we run these meetings. We said to them, now we are going to develop a new identity. So you represent your own actual identity. Talk. We have no agenda. It took half an hour. These people were killing each other. First of all, the language was English. Within half an hour, French and Italian. They began talking in Italian and French. They wouldn't talk in English because they wanted to be all together. So that is why I want European Union not to touch psychology until economy put them together some more.
We need to wrap up soon, so if you would just take a couple more questions.
Take three. Joan, you had one.
My name is Joanne Abed, and I'm in the field of public health. And I was very interested in your initial comments about how we have our personal identity, but there's also this larger identity superimposed on us. And when we're threatened, then that's when we start lashing out at others. And it seems to me that the tragedy of the Arab-Israeli or the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is that both of their reactions to being threatened is to threaten the other. And so that you have this endless cycle of people behaving in exactly the way that's designed to perpetuate the conflict, rather than reaching out as Rabin did, and with the forgiveness, with what, as Sybil says, the supranationality of just erasing all those boundaries. Instead of that, these two peoples are doing precisely the things that are going to perpetuate the conflict.
Like like to ask you to make it a very pointed question. Go ahead.
Yeah. Dr. Baron, sociolinguist by training.
Say Baron?
Baron. Sociolinguist by training. And so I wanted to key on a couple of your points and also on the identity, group identity that you brought up. While you were talking, I couldn't help but think Manchester United. And frankly, I was very recently at the national championships, the baseball national championships, and I saw all kinds of people wearing orange that probably would never wear orange in normal life. I think in our society, we're trained to take on these identities, these group identities, and to think that at that group identity, even though it's a professional sports organization, the people don't even come from whatever city it is that you're supposed to, you're representing, but you're supposed to identify with that. And I think we train that very strongly. And then I wanted to also ask if you could talk a little bit more about the linguistic element of nationalism. In sociolinguistics, we of course look at language and identity. We tend to look at it mostly in terms of language choice, whether you choose a particular code at a particular time, ranging from large groups, whether you're speaking French or English, to dialect differences and so on. And it does seem to be a very important aspect of identity. It's a learned aspect of identity, not always conscious, but learned. And I was wondering if you could talk about that a bit more.
Fran Sachs, I'm a tutor of Latin, French, and Spanish. I was wondering what you would, how you would explain the regression. Why are we having a regression?
That was very short.
Yes. One point. I'm a psychoanalyst, Muriel Morris, a member of this institute, and I just wanted to say that I haven't heard anything said about child-rearing practices, which are of universal concern, and the sadistic practices that we know are going on in the homes and so forth. So,
you want to make a very short question?
Yes, my name is William Soger, and I'm a manager in a factory. And I have many co-workers who are Russian immigrants, Jewish, who, having left the Soviet Union, are recognizing their new identity. One of my customers is a Russian Jewish artist who described to me an experience like you. He said when he was in Russia, he didn't know he was Jewish, but then he got they started beating him up in the schoolyard. Tartars were beating him up after school, their own minority. And when I told my wife about this, she said, well, my dad was also beat up after school for being Jewish in the Bronx. And more recently, she observed to me that Leonard Lopate, a radio personality here in New York, described being beat up after school in Brooklyn. These things are still near us in time and all over the place.
Joan, rephrase your question. Why do they escalate instead of de-escalate? Giorgio?
I think fear, in the Palestinian part, it's really fear on both sides. Mainly, the Jewish state is equipped with the bad historical experience in Europe, and it's projecting its fears and lack of trust in the Palestinians and the Arab. The Palestinians, of course, feel that they injured, their country has been taken from them, although they have never been really as state as such per se, nation state, but they define themselves as a nation that deserve to have borders, recognized borders, etc., etc. And they feel that 78% of their land has been taken. They are willing to give that up, at least the majority of them. I know there are still voices of Arabs, Palestinians who say, well, we want the entire Palestinian state, but the overwhelming majority, the Palestinian national movement has accepted that recognized that they are willing to live on 22 seconds of their historic, what their dream. As Professor Harkabi from the Hebrew University said, we're in a stage of realpolitik, not dreaming now. many Israelis would like to have the Eretz Israel Hagdolah, and many Palestinians would like the entire Palestine. Now we are in a stage of compromise, and this is the only principle we have to work on: compromise to leave room for two national states. The other model that I think of is the Swiss model, maybe creating cantons there. If that is ever that, in the given state of affairs in Palestine now, in Israel and Palestine, I don't think the two national movements are too strong to create anything like that, short of. But my dream that in 50 to 70 to 100 years, after creating two-state solution, there will be the economic reality, the socio-economic reality will force both of them either to unite or to create the Swiss model in the Middle East. I'm almost convinced of that, but not now. Yeah.
Thank you. We've gone for over 2 hours, 2.5 hours, and I think it's time to close. I want to thank Professors Volkan, Woloch, Freddi, and Abed for a wonderful dialogue.